Hey everyone, happy to have you here today. This Brown Bag series has been so successful and we're so grateful that you're here. Thank you so much for attending today with our guest speaker, University Theater Department instructor, Donna Buckley. Very, very grateful that many of you have attended several of this summer's four-part series. We have one remaining, so mark the date of August 13th, another Tuesday. And visual artist, poet, and recently retired university senior lecturer Blair Hobbs will be with us on Tuesday, August 13th. And we also warmly welcome you, a quick pitch for our Friday evening reception this week for the opening of the exhibition, the mid-run of the exhibition Caribbean Art, the Lewison Collection, which is in the galleries behind us. This Friday evening, Ricky Burkhead, percussionist, will be back. We'll be playing, celebrating interesting food and beverage choices as we celebrate a Caribbean collection that has not been on view in quite a while. So very exciting. I think it's roughly 5:30 to 7:30, 5:30 to 8 this Friday night, the 12th of July. And now it's my great privilege to introduce today's speaker. Donna Buckley is a costume technologist, costume designer, and costume historian. She serves as the instructional professor of costume technology at the University of Mississippi. Ms. Buckley received her Master of Fine Arts in Costume Design from Wayne State University in Detroit. Donna's work experience has covered many areas in theater, from musicals and children's theater to classical drama and dance. Some of her favorite films that she's worked on are Superman vs. Batman, Oz the Great and Powerful, and All's Fair in Love. Donna's true passion is historical clothing and historical research. She has worked at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, in their clothing studio, where she recreated historical clothing from the 19th century. She's also worked at the Michigan Renaissance Festival, where her designs were focused on the 16th century. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to our university colleague, Donna Buckley.
Thank you so much. Just to let you know, if you need to get up and leave, don't worry, I'm not going to be offended by that. I understand that this is in the middle of the day and some people have other commitments. And also, if you do have questions, if we can wait to the end, that way I can get through the slides. That way, if somebody does have to leave, we'll be able to get everything accomplished that way. So, to start with, the art of costume design. So, costume design is influenced by history, and we use it in theater and film all the time. In fact, when we see something like this, we consider that eye candy. So, we love that kind of stuff and costuming. So, to start out, to give you a little bit of history of theater and how costumes evolved. So, this is a very brief little history. It starts out with the Greeks. We think that theater started with the Festival of Dionysus. We had prototype theaters there, and the first one of the first ones is in the side of the Acropolis, which you can still see today. This is a theater. I chose this one because I've actually seen a theater production here, and the beauty of this is, how many of you guys have been to Greece and seen a Greek theater? So you would understand that this is the navel, where the chorus would be. Right there in the middle is the navel. If you stand on that area, then all the way at the very top, you're heard. And so the production I saw, I was sitting right here, and you could hear. And so it was amazing what they figured out. Totally amazing. But because of that, they had to do certain things with their costumes. So this is the first time we're starting to see that representation. So if I'm sitting all the way up there in the back and the actors are way down here, how are we going to represent the clothing so the audience knows who the characters are? So here's a modern amphitheater. Let me went the wrong way. We all understand this. So if we kind of cut this in half, it would be like a Greek amphitheater. And how do we know who is on the field? We have these big numbers to communicate. So that's exactly what the Greeks were doing. They had the use of masks, they had props, and if you were an Athenian character, you would be wearing basically what everyday clothing was of the people at that time period. But then you might have characters who are playing gods. They're going to be dressed a certain way. You're going to have characters who were tragedy characters and comic characters. So also, if there was no females on the stage then, so they were, if there was a female character, they would have fake breasts, fake stomachs to try to communicate that this is a female. So here's a look at a tragic actor. If a Greek person saw this from the amphitheater, they would know automatically he's got the tragedy mask on, has the high shoes indicating that, long robes with embroidery and long sleeves. Obviously, this is a tragic actor. So that would communicate that to the audience. Now, if we have a comic character on the other side of the coin, they're usually wearing something very short. And the ancient Greeks were really into having a phallic symbol hang as well. That was very popular. And they would have these little sock shoes called soxes that they would wear. And they would have the comedy mask. So automatically, they're trying to communicate to the audience. Now, there would be, I'm going to go back a few, specialty costumes like over here. Sometimes if you read Greek theater, there's the birds and the frogs, and they have all these interesting characters, and they would have outfits representing that as well. So now we have the Romans coming in. The Romans just basically would steal from cultures, and they certainly did that with the Greeks. Their early dramas were basically very similar to the Greek dramas. They did start to develop their own kind of characters that were, unique. And we start to see the beginning of what's called commedia dell'arte. I don't know if you've heard of that. So it's a comedy. And where the Greeks, the elevated theater, it was a religious experience, and the Romans were like out in the streets with it and in the courtyards and whatnot. So they didn't have the same reverence for theater that the Greeks did. So now we jump to the Middle Ages. So medieval theater, still, throughout this time, we have no costume designer. That title, that person does not exist. Medieval theater starts out of a need to teach people in the churches about the Bible. So you have a population that is mostly illiterate, except for the clergy, and maybe some nobles, the kings or whatever, would be educated, but your average guy in the street is not. And so how do we teach them about the Bible? How are we going to do that? So they start in the churches putting on these little plays, and they're, of course, in their ecclesiastical robes. They're not dressed up as a character or anything like that, but this is the start of it. And then this becomes really popular. Think about it, there's no internet, nothing going on, no TikTok, so this is our main entertainment. And so it starts to take to the streets. And so you see in this illustration, it's on a cart, a little wagon, and they decorate it up. And you see the priests up there delivering their little play. So also happening in medieval times, we have mummers who start to appear. And they're a band of masked persons that would go around during winter festivals. And in the streets, they would enter houses, dance around, play tricks on people. And so they're wearing these popular masks of animals as well. But you can see it's just basically over what their everyday clothing would be. Another thing that's really starts to be popular is after they're in the theater is in the streets and is away from the church, then it starts to be taken on by the communities. And we start to see now sets, basically, right here you can see something where you have all these various stages and for these pageant plays, and the one on the right is Hell's Mouth. That's really popular. when you think about medieval literature at this time, it's very kind of gruesome, and you look at it and think, wow, you guys really are embracing this dark side. So when you have that, we start to see now characters being costumed. So we have a Satan character, and the more gruesome he was, the better they loved it. They were really into that kind of stuff. But the other thing that they were into is taking inspiration from art. So we start to see in the Renaissance this beautiful explosion of artistic subject matter. And so they're looking to that for inspiration, and then incorporating that into the clothing they're using for these pageant plays. Here again, no designers still. And you can see, before we started out with those priests on a little wagon with something around it, and when the community starts to take over, things start to get really elaborate because they start competing with each other. So it starts to become this thing unto itself. Now, when we look at this, you can still see that they're trying to tell the Bible story. We got baby Jesus over here, somebody portraying Mary. We got the angel up here, but it's not what we would think of a Bible story. They're wearing the clothing of the time, and you can see how everything is ornate. It's not humble at all. And so it gets even more elaborate because craft guilds would become involved. So each town would have a craft guild. You would have somebody who makes the barrels, somebody who was a goldsmith, all these different groups, and then they would be responsible for a particular wagon. And then the wagons would go around. You can see in this illustration, you have multiple wagons that are being pulled, and each one would have a little tableau, a little story, and they become very ambitious and very ornate. A lot of money starts to be poured into this stuff. Then, I don't know if anybody ever heard of Oberammergau Passion Play? A couple of you, have you guys been to it? No? So what happens here is, we know this happened in the early 1600s, so I'm taking this slightly out of order. The plague is a big deal. The bubonic plague, people are really scared of it for good reason. It at one point took out 2/3 of Europe, so for very good reason. So this town in Oberammergau, Germany, they make a covenant with God, and they say, if you spare this town from the plague, we will honor you by putting on a pageant play. And to this day, they still do that every 10 years. And I was able to visit the last one. It was off schedule by 2 years because of COVID. And they present this 5-hour pageant play extravaganza with 2,500 people on stage, horses, birds, camels. It's extravaganza. They break it up by having a 3-hour break where they feed you. Literally, they take you to various restaurants and feed you. They've got it down. It's Germans, they got it down. So this is a great example of taking that Bible story and visually representing it. And so each cycle that they do it, they bring in designers and whatnot. So when it first started, it was just the people in the village putting this on. It's still only the people in the village. You have to be from that town to participate in this. But the people who are designers and whatnot, they will bring them in from other places. But if you're acting it, you have to be from that town. It's quite the spectacular thing to see. So another thing that starts to happen is we saw those wagons. And you also had bands of actors going around in those wagons from place to place. And let me tell you, people didn't really think much of actors in that time period. No, they thought they were scoundrels, and I guess people still don't think much of actors, but that's the way it was. And so all of a sudden, in the 16th century, we start to see a permanent building that's dedicated to theater. Now, prior to that, that wasn't the case. And so this is pretty revolutionary. Now we have this stationary place for people to perform. And this is the Globe Theatre in London. This is a representation of what it was like in Shakespeare's time. it would be a completely different experience seeing a Shakespearean show in his time period than it is when we go to theater now. Now when we go to the theater, the lights go down, you have to be quiet, don't go on your cell phone. Then it was a free-for-all. You had somebody walking around selling oranges, people yelling at the stage, people throwing things to actors. And that's why Shakespeare repeats things so many times, because he has to get the point across. We think now, like, seriously, dude? But in that time period, and you got just unquestionable things happening up at the top as well. So there's just a lot going on, and so it was a different kind of experience going to the theater. But in that time period, an Elizabethan person knew exactly who the character was when they walked on stage. In that time period, your position meant a lot, where you were on the totem pole, starting with the king, going all the way down to a peasant. And so they would look at the color of the clothing. They could tell things just like that. There were laws on certain colors that only certain people could wear, sumptuary laws. If you broke that law, they would find you. So by the color of the materials, by the type of materials, this costume would convey a lot to the audience. The Elizabethans would know that automatically. So as soon as a character walked out, by their clothing, the cut of their clothing, what fabric it was made out of, it would be showing automatically to that audience who that person was in the scheme of things. Here again, we have no women still on stage. So that's another thing. When you think of a Shakespearean play, you don't see a lot of intimacy between a male and female character who are romantic. Well, because it's two guys, you know. So it's a different way of presenting theater. This little illustration is really important because it's the only extant image of a Shakespearean play that we know of. Now, in the Renaissance, everybody was so excited about the classics, looking back to Rome, looking back to Greece. And we see this here in the habitat a la Romaine elements that are in this image. You can see they're trying to show a little bit of Roman stuff here. We have it here and here. You can pick it out. And it's like a mishmash of Elizabethan characteristics, and also we're trying to show some Roman characteristics, paying homage to that time period. So then, let me go back to this. When we look at this, when you think of Shakespeare's Globe Theater, they're basically a regional theater. That would be our definition of it today. So a regional theater will have some money, but they're not super rich. So if you go to a repertory theater in Nashville or whatnot, they're going to have a certain level of their production standards, but it's not like they have unlimited resources. Now, the other thing where theater was being performed, it was being performed for royalty. So if you performed at the court, then that would be a different story. So here we have some examples of Indigo Jones, who was a famous designer, not only for clothing, but also for architecture in this time period. And here again, you can see those Roman elements that are still popping out here, but you can see how much more rich the details are of this design and how it's being presented. So it's really amazing when you think about how much was spent on this. A court production is like spending $1 million today, they would be, for a wedding. And usually they're doing wedding or special event. And so that's where a lot of this type of fancy stuff was seen. It'd be wonderful if some of this stuff was still around, but there is none of that left. So then when we jump over into the 17th century, we're not relating to a character or what the character's personality is. We're relating to making things lavish. And in Shakespeare's time, you did have some famous actors who were like our movie stars, and they wore what they wanted. So they would just show up and like, I'm here. So in this time period, you're still seeing this trend to, like with the court, with the court costumes, to be lavish It's just fabulous. So going back to keeping up with that tradition we saw in early Rome, Commedia dell'arte starts to be another form of theater that starts to really cement, and it's around for a while, but the costumes are instantly recognizable. They're stock characters. We have the captain, El Capitan, you see him. And if we think of Harlequin, they're always with the diamonds on their costumes. And so that's something that becomes stock. So as soon as you see that, you would know. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen a Commedia dell'arte performance, but they're like the Three Stooges of Renaissance theater. They're very slapstick, and that's where slapstick came. They have a stick that goes like that when they hit it. So they pretend they're hitting someone, and it makes the noise. It's very, very silly. Then we start late 19th, early 20th century, we start to see this movement towards realism. And at the very end of that 19th century, we start to see somebody who is responsible for costumes and trying to make a look of things. So, I mean, all the way through theater, that's not really something that's been explored. Now we're starting to see it. So in the 20th century, that's when a costume designer really comes into their own. They're really trying to look at the character. They're trying to look at realism. The sets are starting to go with the costumes. They're trying to create world building, where before you had a set person coming in independently of what the costumes are, and then it's just there on stage. And does it match? Nah, they didn't. That wasn't their aesthetic. They weren't trying to do that. They weren't trying to create that look. So now we see this look. And so here's a image of Bette Davis in a movie of Elizabeth I, and you can see it's not really accurate. They're really, they're not really trying to get historically accurate. They're trying to get a flavor of. But then it starts to pull where costume designers are looking at things differently. So when we look at theater, or film, we're looking at basically 4 different types. So you have your historical stuff, you have your fantasy, it's just crazy out there. Dance is another genre that you have to pay attention to if you're doing musicals, and basically modern. So there's these different types that you have to pay attention to. So now it's the 21st century, so we've gotten into the 20th and 21st century. We have the designer, the costume designer, the person who is in charge of creating the world building through clothing, telling a story, either in theater or film. And so how are they going to do that? The role of a designer is, trying to create that balance, that harmony. Because when you think about it, if you look at a stage, or if you look at a film, costumes take about 1/3 of the real estate. So all of you have been watching films, television, going to theater since an early age, and you know a lot more about it than you think you do. You're processing all of that subconsciously as you're watching it. So it's like when you see the first time Darth Vader came out, you automatically knew he's a bad guy. He's dressed the dress, So they're doing all of this stuff, giving you visual clues to let you know about the story of what's happening. And if they're good, the designer's good, their clothes complement everything, but they don't take over where it's just the main show. So when you're working with a designer, you're not working in a vacuum, though. You have to work with other people. It's a collaborative art, which is a good thing and a bad thing all at the same time, because you might have really strong ideas and impulses, and it might be, no. So that can be a problem sometimes, and that happens, it does, and you have to know what battles you're going to have to fight. So what does a designer need to know? Excuse me. A lot. Being a designer is very tiring. I feel like I always say after I'm done designing, I birthed the show, because just all the mental things that you're keeping track of for all the different characters in your head is a lot. So if you are going to be a designer, you have to have a business hat and a creative artistic hat. So creative side, you have to be imaginative. You're creating this world, so you have to think about, how am I going to show that world visually through the clothing? So you have to have a knowledge of fabrics, and you have to have a knowledge of textiles and how things are put together. So that's a lot. Also, knowing history and costumes of the past, and even modern clothing. What are the latest designers? How is that influencing culture? Now it's getting really crazy, like TV shows like Euphoria. You can go on websites where, buy the look. So you watched it the night before, you can go on the website the next day and literally buy it. And so in California, they have these parties where you're buying the clothes and everybody comes dressed as their favorite characters. So it's taking it all to a new level that didn't exist before because of technology. So when you're starting out, you have to be able to break down the script and start asking questions about, who are these people in this script? How am I going to show what they are and who they are? And you do that by using a lot of plots, figuring out who's in what scene, and I'm not going to bore you with all those mechanics, but you need to know it. You have to do a lot of paperwork, otherwise you show up one day and it's dress rehearsal and you're like, oh, I forgot that person was in that scene. So you don't want to have egg on your face. You are also working with actors who can be sometimes temperamental artists, and how do you handle that? Or they're insecure with themselves and their body. And so you're trying to present this look for them and have them buy into it, and that's really a delicate thing to do. So another thing is, if you're working on a film or even theater, understanding scheduling, that's a business side of it. Understanding the technology of what genre you're working in. If it's film, what does the camera see? If it's theater and you're proscenium stage, like the Ford Center, well, I'm going to put different kind of clothing on the Ford Center than I am in a tiny little black box theater because the audience is so far away. My scale has to be different. So understanding all of that. And also, sometimes if you work in film, you have a large team working with you of assistants and interns. So a lot of things to figure out. So once you're getting into the design process and you're starting all of that, you've read the script. You're going to look, you need inspiration. And I don't care if it's a famous fashion designer, they're not coming up with anything in a box. Everybody's influenced by culture. Everybody's influenced by the past. And when you start looking at that, you can see, oh, Gucci, you took that from the 1600s, or you took that. And literally, I have students who will break down pictures of certain designers, and you can literally pull out different time periods. So they're looking to all of this for inspiration, and that's just normal. And where do I get that? So that starts the process, and also you have to come up with what's called a concept. We have to come up with, as a team, how we're telling the story. And we all have to be on the same page, and it has to be unified. Because if I have the costumes over here doing everything's in neon, and over here the set's hyper-realistic, the audience is going, what the heck is going on visually, and they're going to be pulled out of the story. The thing is to complement the story, not pull people out of the story. So why is this important? It becomes a unified thread. Everything is married together. And that's when things really start to work. And it also gives you a place to go. If we know this is an avant-garde production and everything is going to be that way, then that gives me a license as a designer to go over here and look at avant-garde things and get inspiration. But if I go over here and I get avant-garde inspiration, but the director's over here in hyper-realistic stuff, those things aren't going to be matching. So that's why it's really good to understand that. And a concept helps us when we're taking those words of the playwright or the screenplay and we're trying to make them a visual representation of the story. So that's why it's really helpful. Otherwise, you have people going in all these directions, like throwing darts at a dartboard, hoping it's going to stick. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't. And I'm sure we've all seen things where they weren't married and you're pulled out of it. So here's one. This is a candy concept. So this was Marie Antoinette, 2006, and the concept was candy because she was an young teenager when she came to France. And I tell my students, can you imagine running a country when you're in high school? And they're all like, no. But that's basically what was happening here. And the director wanted to represent her youthfulness, how young she was with coming to France, and So they came up with this idea that everything is pastel and very light, very much like candy. And so it really does visually work. You still have the silhouette, the cutout of the 18th century clothing. Everything is still very accurate, but all the colors are within that concept. So another thing you have to do is you have to analyze that script. You're asking your questions like, what time period is this in? What is the jobs that these people do? Is it cold out? Is it winter, like Dr. Zhivago? Because obviously you're going to put different clothes on somebody in the winter than you would summer. What are the relationships these people have? What are their functions in the script, as the protagonist? So you're looking at the script, trying to pull out any clues that you can find. And that's really helpful when you're trying to create a character. So, like I said, then you are going to, after you're pulling all this out and you're finding that information from the script, then you're going to have to meet with your team. It's going to be a director, lighting designer, set designer, and you're going to go through that script and you're going to figure that all out. It's a collaboration. But you also have to figure out then, well, how much budget do we have for this? And how much time do we have to put this together? And when you work on film, it's a completely different timetable than it is with theater. So having to understand that is really helpful. So like I said, nothing is done in a vacuum. Designers look to the past for inspiration. And when we see that, when we look at something, we think, oh my gosh, it's so innovative. But then when you look at the history, you can see how this designer was really directly influenced from things from the past. So you have the influence from a Russian duchess over here, and then you have influence from one of the Mongol Khan's last wives. So you get both of those side by side, and you're like, oh, I can see that. Here again, you can see the inspiration for this costume. Now, when you see this full length and you see it next to this, you can see the designer said, I'm taking this, but I'm going to change this a little, and I'm going to change that a little. It's not a direct pull from it, but you can see the inspiration from it. So how did a designer, how do they get their information? Primary resources is really helpful. So what does that mean? Looking at extant gowns, looking at fashion plates. If you're doing something from ancient Greece, you might have to look at a statue. Sears catalogs are great, love them. If you're doing something from the time that they were really popular, and I have them from like 1898. You just pull up, and there's just like, oh, it's just amazing. Other places that designers look are art museums. So if I want to do a particular thing like this, I love this book because it puts things side by side. So I'm doing something from the Renaissance and I'm looking at the sleeves. I might take this sleeve, put it on this dress, and I might add this ruff to it. So it's a mishmash of taking things that inspire. It's like, oh, I love this. That really speaks to me. That really speaks to the character. And so that's another thing that we will look at. So here's an example. This was here at the museum. I brought my students. We set things up in this room. This is a Civil War infantryman jacket. And what they would do, their excitement was to take measurements and document this as if they were going to try to reproduce this. So this is another example. My students came and we did the same thing with this gown right here. And here again, garments like this can be really exciting for us as costumers to be able to take and look and sometimes make actual reproductions of. And I've done that before. A show I was doing in the 1930s. There was a great house that was that belonged to the owners who created Dodge back in the 20s. It's kind of like the Vanderbilt house in Asheville, North Carolina. I think I'm saying that right. And they had a collection, and I was able to go in, take measurements, and then reproduce it for the stage. So this kind of stuff is really great for a costume designer to see. Also looking at culture, what's happening culturally. So it might not necessarily be all pictures. We might have to look at text, do some research on things like that when we're trying to create the world. We like to create inspiration boards, and then we'll take these into the meetings, and we're showing this to the director, like, hey, this is the direction I'm going. So this is all tools for us to communicate with the director. So he can say, not really a fan of the purple. Let's pull back here. And so then you're like, okay, well, what are you thinking? So we're trying to, it's not that this is sacred art to us, it's communication with our team. Here's another thing, color can also help convey information about the character, where they are. Like I was talking about the Darth Vader, obviously that color conveyed a lot about that character. And some shows are just based in certain parts with color, like this is from Wicked, and so obviously green is very important in that particular show. So here's another inspiration board where this person is taking all these different things from the time period, showing it to the director. What do you think? The director might say, love this, don't like that, whatever. Now sometimes if you're working on a huge movie, you don't have time to draw things out. And so they'll do inspiration boards like this, which then can take the place of rendering, where, hey, this character over here, these are the looks, this is the style I'm going for, does that work for you? And so that's another way of doing it. So like I was talking about before, it wasn't so much about characters, now it's about characters. And when we talk about, I was showing you that picture of Bette Davis, when she's playing Elizabeth I. Before there was a studio system and you're dressing the star to be the star. And now we look at the character. We look at the script and try to figure out the psychology of that person and what would that person have in their closet based on how they tick. So that's how we approach it now, not like in the past. So then once we get all that information, we've done our research, we've kind of figured that all out, we figured out from analyzing what our world is going to look like, then we start drawing preliminary sketches. You don't want to come in at the very start with full renderings of things because it might not be what the team ends up doing. So we start kind of rough inspiration, now we're doing some rough drawings, is this what you like? And then after we've done that, where you can see the line and the shape of the garment, then we can start going into final renderings. So the thing with final renderings is that everybody's style is different, and that's okay. So you get some people over, like this guy, I think that's beautiful. It looks like it could be in an art museum. And then you have this person over here, is just scribbling all over the place. Hey, there's a little drawing. You got to pay attention to this side of the costume, and we're doing X, Y, and Z with it. So they vary. They really vary depending on the style of the artist and how they like to communicate. Because not only does this particular drawing help the director, then afterwards it's going to help the people who build the costume. So whoever's building that costume will go to this as the blueprint, basically. So here's an example of final renderings, and like I was talking about having a blueprint, you can see these little drawings on the side. What that's indicating to the shop, the people who are making it, this is what the back of this dress looks like. And you'll get sometimes you will just have this, and you'll have a separate thing where they do a completely separate drawing that's in pencil, and that's called a working drawing. Because if we go back to this, I don't think if I was the shop, I would be able to make that costume. I can't really tell where the seams are. I can't tell where one part of it starts and one part of it stops. It's kind of muddy for me, right? So I would say to that designer, can you give me a working drawing sketch so then I can see exactly how you want this built? So some of them are very artistic, giving you a feel, but when it gets to the next part, the part 2 of the design process, you need a little more information. So the next part is the production process. So when you design something, you have to realize that Not everything that you design is going to be built from scratch. I've worked on movies with $40 million budgets just for costumes, and not everything was built for scratch. Sometimes garments have to be rented or pulled from a certain stock. If you have a theater who has their own stock of costumes, you will pull from that. Sometimes you're shopping, you're going to Walmart. It's not glamorous. And sometimes if you're lucky, you can have your rendering that you present, like those ones from Titanic, where it's actually built. And that's just a beautiful process. So to do that, though, you have to understand fabric, because that's your medium. So you go from this two-dimensional medium of the drawing into the three-dimensional medium of the garment, and instead of using paint and watercolor, now you're using fabric. So you have to understand fabric. You have to do research with fabric to understand what fabric's going to convey that this is a rich person. If I'm putting corduroy on this elegant, rich woman, it's not really going to convey that she's elegant and rich. I want satin probably would be a better choice. So having an understanding of fabrics for different time periods is very, very helpful. And knowing what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And understanding what is appropriate one time period is not appropriate in another. Putting something in spandex, something made out of spandex from a previous century really is not going to give you the look you want. Anything prior to the 20th century was all natural fibers. You would not see anything synthetic. And so understanding that and knowing that if I want this to look right, I have to use fabric and textiles that will make it look the way it was. So then after you get to understanding that, you're getting into the construction process. So we have the rendering that we're working off. That's our blueprint. Now this particular rendering was Disney hired a concept artist to draw it. Then they brought on the costume designer. Now the costume designer had to do homage to what Disney signed off with the concept costume designer. And the hard part is these people are fabulous in drawing, but they have no idea what it means to make anything. No idea. And so then we have to take that, and then we have to make it a three-dimensional realistic thing, which is a challenge, and it's fun. Like, they came in and they gave me bolts of fabric, and they said, okay, you have 24 hours. They had you could see the dress was here, was already made up, and then I had to put all of this stuff on to make it work. So it's fun, but like I said, it can be a challenge. Here again, we have this conceptual thing here. How in the heck are you going to make sleeves like that? So we had a cutter draper who was phenomenal, and he was able to figure out this whole thing, and it only had one seam, but it was all this little intricate pleating, and then when you turned it out, then it came out like this. Now I made 3 of those because you make everything in multiples on film, and I wouldn't be able to tell you how I made it because he came up with this thing to try to represent this. So sometimes it can be really interesting because you're working with multiple people in this process. So a costume designer's job is to create realistic characters either on the stage or the screen, not to have actors playing dress up. And so when you think about iconic characters and iconic costumes, you can see that. And those are the things that stick in our mind. They are, we hear talk about a certain film or something, and automatically an image will come to our mind. It becomes a part of our society. And like I said, it's because a third of the real estate on the stage or the screen is the clothing. So that is what I wanted to present to you. So I want to thank you for coming. And if anybody has any questions, does anybody have questions? Yes.
One of the things I've noticed is you have to be an artist before you become a designer in this, because you have to portray everything
Yes, you do. You have designers who cannot draw at all.
Really?
Yes.
And how do they overcome that?
Images, like they will find a bunch of images like that one I showed you for television where you had all the different pictures. They'll communicate like that. In fact, the gentleman I showed you back here, he doesn't draw. I've worked with him on a couple films. He's a phenomenal designer, but he doesn't draw. So he's made a good career in Hollywood just without even having to do that. And it's gotten to the point, and when you're working on film, that they're doing things so quickly, there's not pre-production time for costuming. They bring that talent in much later than they bring other production elements in, and so you don't have time. You're just getting it up and running.
So a designer wouldn't necessarily be able to sew or build either, would they, or would they?
Some don't. And some design schools do not teach you how to sew, but if you know how to sew, it's very helpful, because if you're handing a sketch over and you have no idea of how things are put together, then that can cause a lot of problems as well. Yes?
Who owns the costumes and what happens to them after the production is over?
So, like here on this campus, the university owns it. It goes into our costume stock. If it's a regional theater, then they will keep the clothing in their stock. If it's owned by them. If it's a movie and it was built for the movie, then it goes into some warehouse in LA or something, and it's not really known where it goes.
What, could it come back in another film?
It could. So say, for example, if it's something from Warner Brothers or Paramount Studio that the film is made under, they have their huge costume shops in LA, and so they will get trucks loads of clothing after a movie is wrapped, and they put that in their stock. And so say if I was a up-and-coming designer and I wanted to find clothing, say for example from the 1800s, I could go to that huge warehouse, and they have it all divided up by time periods, and I could rent things from them. They have like over 100,000 pieces of clothing. Yes?
When I was young and I would watch the Academy Awards, one of the things I looked at, because I love costume, would see about the awards for different movies. And it was real popular back then, because then they would show like the costumes and such. And I know one of the big ones back in the late 40s, early 50s was Edith Head.
Yes.
Do they still, I don't watch the Academy Awards anymore, do they still give out the awards for costumes?
They do. They do still have a costume design award. Edith Head was, I don't know if you all know about her, she was a very popular 20th century costume designer, extremely prolific in her designs. Any other questions? Yes?
How far when you work on the theater productions, how far in advance do you start working on the costumes?
For example, this fall I will start working on, I'm designing Julius Caesar. That will not go into production until the early spring, and then it will be performed in April. So there's a good bit of time when you're working. Now, film that I designed, I only had 4 weeks to come up with things. So it really depends on the level of the project and the money and who's doing it. Oh, way back there.
On the film, let's say here you were talking about you get 3 copies,
Yes.
but let's say you're doing a scene and this character is being dragged through the mud and it's destroying.
Yes.
What do you do?
What you do is if you don't have much time, that you're going to get a hold of ready-made things and just dress it. And so for example, Indiana Jones, we all know that outfit. So Tom Selleck was actually the first Indiana Jones. I don't know if you all know that, but then he got Magnum PI. Is it Magnum PI? I think so, yes. So he dropped out. And then Harrison Ford came in, and so Deborah Scott was the designer, and she's freaking out. So she had it already made for Harrison Ford, who was much different than, Tom Selleck, who was much different than Harrison Ford. So she had the jacket made in London, brand new, and they did a rush job on it, overnighted it back to America. And she talks about her and Harrison Ford stayed up all night distressing the jacket. He helped her to get it to what it needed to look like. So you get into these situations, and in film, they don't care if they want to hear yes, they don't want to hear no, and so you just have to figure out, well, how am I going to make it work? Yes, Robert.
Something I'm watching currently on Netflix avidly, I have to confess, is Bridgerton, and it's just staggering, the costumes, but the story arc of the characters is they're so larger than life. You wonder, should I even care if there's historical authenticity? So I guess I'm asking, should I care if the costumes are historically Regency period London? I tend to not care, but it's fascinating because they're so elaborate.
Well, the way I look at it is sometimes I can step aside knowing that it's not historically accurate, like Bridgerton, if it's really good acting, really good writing. But if it's not, to me, like Rain, young people like that, it's like David Bridle meets the 16th century, and it's so bad to me, I can't watch it. But there are some productions where I can turn that off. It just depends on it. But I tend to like things that are historically accurate because I like to be absorbed into the story of what the period was in the past and what the people were like in the past. But that's me. I really love the history. Some people don't care about that.
So in the case of Bridgerton, do you know whether it's accurate?
It's not. Especially the fabric choices are not.
But Downton Abbey must have.
Downton Abbey, oh yes, that's like on the other side of the spectrum. Yeah.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Great answer. Thanks.
Yes.
What about fabrics, if you have to actually construct, have one made? Where do you find your fabrics? It's just as a home sewer, it seems like you can't find them.
You can't find them here. I mean, if somebody's working in film and theater, there's a garment district in New York and there's a garment district in LA, there's one in London. And so they'll be going to places like that where they can source things. Or Colleen Atwood, I don't know if you guys know of her, she's done a lot of Hollywood films. She talks about how you can't get fabric like you used to, so she would get something because you know you're gonna have to make multiples, like she did Memoirs of a Geisha, and she would silk print it. So she would make the fabric work for what she needed, knowing that she was not gonna get exactly what she wanted. I saw a hand, Melanie.
So could you talk about you're talking about the structure and like the building process.
Yes.
You also talk about how they also have to think about accessibility as far as, like layers and dressing the actors, because that could become an issue of like the time and accessibility to dress them. So is there a thought process there?
Absolutely. So for example, love this dress, but if we were going to use this in the theater, it might have a hidden zipper. It might have huge snaps that you can't see so they can get out of it fast. It may or may not have a corset. It just depends what the script calls for. Made a beautiful, beautiful 1890s dress, but we had to put a zipper this big in the back because the actress had to be taking the dress off as she walked off and then came on the other side in a different outfit that she wore underneath. So we have to deal with that all the time. It's like, oh, great, she's got a 30-second change. How in the heck are we going to get her out of something period and into something else? So there's a lot of that will happen, especially in theater. Yes, sir.
That reminded me, you had one slide up there with a group of quotes, I'm going to say, in a circle, and one of them sort of addresses that the script contained many costume plots.
Yes.
So it's not just looking at a character with a particular costume, that might set the tone for the character, but what would the transition in costume be as they go through different scenes, or on stage a very rapid change?
Right, so what'll happen is some characters will have a character arc. So they start here and then things happen to them in the story and then they'll end up over here, so it could be a good character arc or they're down in the dumps or whatever. And so as a costumer, we have to figure out what those looks are. And you'll see this sometimes in a film where they start out and they're young and they're innocent and pretty, and then they go through this arc and they're, bitter old woman. How do they get from here to here? So you have to figure that out and map it out as a designer. So you're going to design all those looks for them. Now, if it's film, they could, and that character as a lead actor, they might have 100 looks. And each of those looks might have multiple costumes, depending on what's required by the script. And you think about if you're doing a Western and they're outside and it's, nasty or whatever, then what is their clothes going to look like? Or if there's a gunfight and we have squibs that go like this for bullet holes, and then we have to deal with that. So there's a lot of different elements. Yes?
You've described some ideal situations where you have a number of different personnel doing all the different stages, but in a university department or a regional or community theater, you need some multi-talented people who can.
You have to wear a lot of hats.
A number of those talents.
Yes.
That slide.
Pardon?
That's like that slide, the hats.
Yes, you have to, and you have to realize I'm doing a university production. I'm not doing a $40 million costume budget. So we have to learn to play in that sandbox. And what are my limitations? And I can't design something grandiose that's going to take 200 hours when I have 25 other characters on that stage that have to be clothed as well. So it's taking all that into consideration.
Do you take period donation of clothing?
Yes.
So you can source at the university?
We take period donations, is that what you're asking?
So that you can have ready-mades for production?
But the problem is, as you can see here, our lovely lady, there's no way that's going to fit on a modern actress. So that's the thing that we're finding, that the modern physique is really different than previous time periods. So a lot of period clothing will not fit most actors. You're a curator, you understand this, that there's a lot of thought out there that's actually sacrilege to put somebody in something that's period.
Well, I'm not saying more like 20th century. Is there like a cutoff for you guys?
But even like the 50s probably would be the cutoff, because you think of the body, your body oils and all of that starts to break all of that down really quickly, and so it can have effect on that.
Did you guys have a stock and you're finding that you're having to change some of your...
We have a stock, and we find that a lot of the things that we have from previous decades do not fit the average student now.
So you're not only having to use this budget, you're having to create whole new things to have the same stock.
Right. Yes.
You mentioned corsets. Is there resources for
Oh, yes.
historical information on undergarments?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not.
Because let's go back to our friends at the end. This lady right here, she has on a corset. That's why it can lay the way it does. And she also has what's called a panier, and it goes out like that. So if you've seen some from the 1700s, a lot of them will do that. You have to have that structure, otherwise it'll just lay flat like a regular dress. And especially during this time period, there are a lot of men in the noble class that would wear male corsets as well. That's how they could have this whole look like that, you know what I mean? Because we tend to do this, a corset's going to make you do that. And usually a lady, if you can see it in this image actually, her legs are not crossed and they're not together. Because the corset came down like this, and she had to set with her legs apart because of that point. Otherwise, it would be uncomfortable.
So is that three men? The woman, the one that dresses a man also?
No, it's a woman. She's not a very attractive woman.
Women weren't really accepted into it.
Pardon?
I thought women weren't really that men were always playing women.
That is correct. Men were playing women. This is just an image of period people. women started to enter the stage in the 1600s when Charles II was the king on the throne, and his mistress, she was really into helping women become prominent in theater, and so that changed that in the 1600s. Yes?
Do you have a source for historical shoes?
There's more and more things starting to be available than there was 20 years ago. There are reenactors, people who concentrate just on making shoes from different time periods, which is fabulous. They're not cheap though. Not cheap at all. So there's, I mean, especially in Europe, there are all these societies that represent in different time periods, like the Vikings or the Anglo-Saxons or things like that. Great. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate you coming. This has been fabulous. Thank you so much.